The photograph was taken in 1861 during renovation work on the Charles Bridge in Prague. I discovered it in the Czech National Archive, misfiled among unrelated municipal records. The image showed workers standing on wooden scaffolding above the Vltava River, their tools resting against medieval stonework. Beneath them, barely visible in the sepia tones, the submerged pier bases displayed geometric precision that should not have existed in 14th century construction. The curves were too perfect, the joints too consistent. I measured the visible masonry against documented medieval techniques. The tolerances did not match. Someone had built those foundations long before Emperor Charles IV claimed credit. These bridges had no known builders. The official history of the stone bridge at Regensburg credits Bishop Otto I with commissioning its construction in 1135. For nearly 9 centuries, this narrative has remained unchallenged. The bridge spans the Danube at a point where the river narrows between limestone cliffs, connecting the old town to the northern districts. Medieval chronicles describe it as a marvel of Romanesque engineering, a testament to 12th century ambition and skill. I accepted this account without question until I began examining the construction records themselves. The earliest documentation I found in the Bavarian State Archives dated not from 1135, but from 1146, 11 years after the supposed groundbreaking. These records described ongoing work on the superstructure, payments to stonemasons for arch completion, and purchases of iron clamps for securing the roadway. The language was specific and detailed. Yet when I searched for earlier records describing foundation work, pier installation, or riverbed excavation, I found nothing. The archives contained extensive documentation of medieval construction projects across Bavaria. Bridge foundations required the most complex engineering of any phase, involving cofferdams, pile driving, and underwater masonry. Such work would have generated substantial records. For Regensburg, those records did not exist. I obtained permission to examine the bridge's physical structure during a 2019 maintenance closure. The underwater piers were accessible through temporary cofferdams installed for concrete repair work. What I observed contradicted everything the medieval narrative suggested. The pier bases were not constructed from the rough-cut limestone blocks typical of Romanesque construction. Instead, they consisted of precisely fitted granite segments with joints so tight that no mortar was visible. The curvature of each pier followed a mathematical regularity that medieval masons, working in moving water with period technology, should not have achieved. I measured the visible stonework using photogrammetric techniques, creating 3-dimensional models of 4 pier bases. The geometric analysis revealed something unexpected. Each pier displayed identical proportions, with height-to-width ratios of exactly 3.2 to 1. Medieval bridge construction involved constant adaptation to riverbed conditions. Geological variation, current patterns, and foundation depth all demanded site-specific solutions. These piers showed no such adaptation. They appeared to have been built to a single template, as if precision had been more important than practicality. A maintenance report from 1883, held in the Regensburg Municipal Archives, referenced what the engineer called anomalous substructures beneath Pier 7. The report described a sealed stone chamber approximately 2 meters in depth, accessible through a mortared aperture that had been closed at some undetermined earlier date. The engineer recommended no further investigation, classifying the chamber as structurally irrelevant. His language was careful, almost evasive. He documented the chamber's existence without speculating on its purpose or origin. I searched for similar reports across the bridge's maintenance history. A 1921 inspection noted comparable sealed voids beneath Piers 3 and 11. A 1956 assessment mentioned inherited hydraulic features of uncertain function. Each report acknowledged something unusual beneath the medieval stonework. None attempted to explain it. The pattern of documentation was consistent. Engineers encountered anomalies, recorded them in clinical language, and recommended sealing or avoidance. The chambers were treated as problems to be contained rather than mysteries to be solved. The medieval chronicles that credit Bishop Otto I with the bridge's construction use revealing language. The Latin texts describe the bishop as having renovatum pontem, renewed the bridge rather than construxis, built it. Medieval Latin distinguished carefully between these concepts. Renovation implied something pre-existing that required restoration. Construction implied creation from nothing. The chroniclers chose renovation. For 8 centuries, translators rendered this as built, obscuring what the original authors had actually written. I found a similar pattern in a 1476 survey commissioned by the Regensburg City Council. The surveyor described the bridge's foundations as antiquiores quam memoria, older than memory. He was documenting a structure whose origins the 15th century had already forgotten. The piers beneath the water, he noted, bore no mason's marks. Medieval stonemasons signed their work. The absence of marks suggested either that the builders predated the practice or that they followed different traditions entirely. The stone itself presented contradictions. Petrographic analysis conducted during the 2019 maintenance work identified the pier material as granite, with a crystalline density exceeding any documented Bavarian quarry source. The superstructure used local limestone, consistent with medieval supply chains. The foundations used stone that should not have been available to 12th century builders, transported from sources that remain unidentified. Either Bishop Otto's engineers had access to quarries and transport networks that left no historical trace, or they built upon foundations that someone else had placed. I examined construction records from other medieval bridges across the former Holy Roman Empire. The pattern repeated. The Judith Bridge in Prague, predecessor to the Charles Bridge, was documented as restored in 1172, but never as originally constructed. The old main bridge in Würzburg showed foundation stonework inconsistent with its attributed 15th century construction date. Each bridge credited to medieval builders rested on foundations that predated their supposed construction. Each set of records documented superstructure work while remaining silent on who had built what lay beneath. If these foundations were not medieval, when were they built? The question led me to historical cartography. Maps from the 16th and 17th centuries showed the Danube crossing at Regensburg as an established feature, unremarkable and ancient. Earlier maps, those from the 14th and 15th centuries, depicted the same crossing with notations indicating its age was unknown even then. The bridge existed before reliable records began. It functioned before anyone thought to document its origins. The medieval builders had not constructed the stone bridge at Regensburg. They had inherited it, adapted it, claimed credit for it, and gradually erased the evidence of what they had found. The foundations remained, bearing loads they were never officially designed to bear, constructed with precision that exceeded the technology of any era that claimed to have built them. The sealed chambers beneath the piers held whatever functions they had always held, their purposes forgotten, their existence systematically concealed. I could not yet explain who had built these foundations, but I could no longer accept that they had been built in 1135. I began searching for comparable structures beyond the Danube. If the Regensburg anomalies were unique, they might be explained as local geological peculiarities or documentation gaps. If they repeated elsewhere, something more systematic was at work. The archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France contained engineering assessments of the Pont d'Avignon, the famous bridge across the Rhône that collapsed partially in the 17th century. The surviving arches, 4 of an original 22, had been studied extensively. I obtained access to inspection records from 1820 conducted during early preservation efforts. The French engineer who examined the remaining piers documented what he called inexplicable geometric consistency across structures separated by hundreds of meters of river. His measurements showed identical pier-to-span ratios despite the Rhone's variable depth and current patterns at different crossing points. Medieval bridge builders adapted to site conditions. They did not impose uniform geometry on variable terrain. Yet the Pont d'Avignon displayed the same mathematical regularity I had observed at Regensburg. The ratio was 3.2 to 1, exactly matching the Bavarian measurements. The official history credits the bridge's construction to the 12th century, attributing it to Saint Benezet, a shepherd boy who claimed divine instruction to build a crossing. The legend provided a convenient origin story, mystical enough to discourage further inquiry. But the 1820 inspection report used language that troubled me. The engineer described the foundations as appearing anterior to the documented construction phase. He noted that underwater stonework showed no evidence of the cofferdam construction that 12th century techniques would have required. The piers seemed to have been placed without displacing the riverbed at all. I compared his observations to geological surveys conducted in 1987 during stabilization work on the surviving arches. Modern sonar imaging revealed that the pier bases extended deeper than any medieval construction technique could have achieved. The foundations penetrated 15 meters into the riverbed, anchored in bedrock that 12th century engineers could not have reached without technologies they did not possess. The 1987 report classified this depth as anomalous, but offered no explanation. The engineers stabilized what they found and moved on. From Avignon, I traced the pattern eastward. The Charles Bridge in Prague, constructed between 1357 and 1402 under Emperor Charles IV, displayed identical characteristics. I examined archival photographs from 1890 held in the Czech National Archive, taken during repairs following flood damage. The images showed exposed pier bases with the same geometric precision, the same absence of adaptation to riverbed variation, the same impossibly tight joints between massive stone segments. The Charles Bridge piers used sandstone for their visible portions, but granite for their submerged foundations. Granite that Czech geological surveys could not source to any known Bohemian quarry. A construction diary, attributed to Peter Parler, the German architect credited with the bridge's design, survived in fragmentary form. I located a transcription in the Prague Castle archives. Parler described his work on the arches, the towers, and the sculptural program in detail. His entries regarding the foundations were notably brief. He referenced existing pier positions and noted that his task involved connecting structures already in place. The language suggested he was building upon rather than building from. His diary never described foundation excavation, pier installation, or underwater construction of any kind. I found a 1412 municipal record that referenced the bridge using the Czech phrase "Starý základ," old foundation. The bridge was barely 50 years complete by official chronology, yet contemporary documents already described its foundations as old. Either the terminology was careless, or the writers knew something the official history concealed. Medieval scribes were precise with language. They distinguished between new construction and inherited infrastructure. The choice of Starý was deliberate. The pattern extended into territories that 17th century cartographers had labeled as Tartaria. I obtained engineering assessments of the Trinity Bridge in St. Petersburg, built in its current form between 1897 and 1903. Soviet-era inspection records from 1934, declassified after 1991, documented sealed chambers beneath multiple piers. The chambers were described as predating the 19th century construction, their walls lined with stone blocks that Russian engineers could not identify as matching any imperial quarry. The 1934 report recommended permanent sealing, which was carried out without further investigation. I overlaid scaled diagrams from Regensburg, Avignon, Prague, and St. Petersburg. The geometric relationships were not merely similar. They were identical within measurement tolerances of 2%. 4 bridges spanning 4 rivers in 4 countries, attributed to construction dates ranging from 1135 to 1903, displayed the same pier-to-span ratios, the same foundation depths relative to river width, the same mathematical proportions that should have been calculated independently based on site-specific conditions. Different rivers demanded different engineering solutions. The Danube at Regensburg flows faster than the Rhone at Avignon. The Vltava in Prague freezes more severely than the Neva in St. Petersburg. Current patterns, flood cycles, geological substrates, and ice loads all varied dramatically across these sites. Engineers designing for these rivers should have arrived at different geometric solutions. Instead, they arrived at identical ones, as if they were all working from the same template. Historical maps provided context I had initially overlooked. Joan Bleu's 1662 atlas, depicted Central and Eastern Europe with territorial labels that modern cartography had abandoned. The regions containing Regensburg, Prague, and St. Petersburg all fell within boundaries marked as Tartaria or its variants. Mainstream historians dismissed these labels as European ignorance of Eurasian geography, placeholder names for poorly understood territories. But the architectural evidence suggested another possibility. These regions shared infrastructure characteristics that transcended their supposed construction dates. The Tartarian hypothesis proposed that these bridges were not built independently by medieval bishops, Renaissance emperors, or imperial Russian engineers. They were remnants of an earlier civilization whose extent matched the Tartaria marked on pre-19th century maps. The hypothesis remained controversial, unsupported by mainstream archaeology, but the measurements did not lie. The geometric consistency demanded explanation. Either every bridge engineer across 8 centuries independently arrived at identical solutions despite vastly different site conditions, or they were all adapting the same inherited infrastructure. I could not yet prove the Tartarian interpretation. The evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive, but I could no longer dismiss it as mere speculation. The foundations beneath these bridges shared characteristics that defied coincidence. They were older than their credited construction dates, built with precision exceeding period technology, and constructed from materials that official supply chains could not explain. Something had built them, something that left no names, no records, no credit. Something that every subsequent era had simply inherited and claimed as its own. The Eads Bridge in St. Louis, Missouri. Louis presented a different kind of evidence. Completed in 1874, it was thoroughly documented by modern standards. James Buchanan Eads, the credited engineer, kept detailed records of his innovative pneumatic caisson construction, the pressurized chambers that allowed workers to excavate riverbed material while keeping the Mississippi's waters at bay. His personal papers, held at the Missouri Historical Society, described the challenges of sinking foundations 136 feet below water level on the eastern approach. The documentation appeared complete, yet the excavation logs contained entries that troubled me. A notation from March 1870 referenced encountered masonry at depth inconsistent with geological survey. Eads had expected to find bedrock beneath layers of sand and gravel. Instead, his workers found cut stone blocks arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. The entry was brief, almost dismissive, noting only that work continued after clearing the obstruction. No investigation was conducted. No samples were preserved for analysis. The stone was removed, the caisson advanced, and the discovery was not mentioned again in Eads's published writings. I located renovation photographs from 1936 in the St. Louis Public Library's archive. The images showed maintenance work on the eastern abutment, where workers had exposed sections of sub-foundation during concrete repair. Visible in 3 photographs were courses of red brick extending beneath the credited 1874 construction level. The brickwork displayed the same uniformity I had observed in descriptions of anomalous infrastructure across Europe and Russia. The bricks were perfectly regular, kiln-fired to temperatures that required sophisticated fuel control, and arranged in patterns that continued beyond the photograph's frame. A handwritten annotation on one photograph read simply, "Origin unknown, sealed per directive." No directive number was cited. No explanation accompanied the decision. The brickwork was covered with concrete and the renovation completed. I searched for any formal report addressing the discovery. None existed in the public record. The pattern of documentation and erasure had become unmistakable. Across 4 continents, engineers encountered anomalous substructures beneath bridges they believed they were building or maintaining. Each time, the response followed the same sequence. Brief documentation using neutral language. Classification as structurally irrelevant or of unknown origin. Sealing with concrete or mortar. No investigation, no analysis, no attempt to understand what had been found. Between 1920 and 1955, I documented 17 major bridge renovation projects that explicitly mentioned sealing previously accessible chambers or voids. Westminster Bridge in London, 1926. The Anichkov Bridge in St. Petersburg, Petersburg, 1934. The Pont Neuf in Paris, 1948. The Chain Bridge in Budapest, 1952. Each project generated work orders that described the anomalies in identical bureaucratic language, non-functional cavities, pre-existing infrastructure of uncertain date, voids requiring stabilization. The terminology varied slightly across languages and decades, but the meaning remained consistent. Something was there that should not have been there, and the solution was always to seal it away. I examined the linguistic patterns in construction documents across multiple archives. A subtle but significant shift occurred around the 1880s, consistent across English, German, French, and Russian sources. Earlier documents, those from the 1840s through the 1870s, frequently used terminology acknowledging inheritance. The English word restoration appeared in contexts where modern usage would expect construction. The German Wiederherstellung, meaning re-establishment, described projects that official histories classified as original construction. The French remise en état, putting back in order, implied a return to previous conditions rather than creation of new ones. After 1880, the terminology changed. Documents began describing the same structures using language of original construction. Bridges that earlier generations had restored were now described as having been built. The shift was gradual but comprehensive. By 1900, the inheritance language had largely disappeared from official engineering discourse. Bridges were built by credited engineers in credited eras. The foundations they rested upon became invisible in the documentation. Neither built nor inherited, simply assumed to have always existed as part of the credited construction. This linguistic shift coincided with the rise of nationalist engineering narratives. Victorian Britain, Imperial Germany, the French Third Republic, and Tsarist Russia all sought to demonstrate technological superiority through infrastructure achievements. Acknowledging that your most impressive bridges rested on inherited foundations would undermine claims of national engineering prowess. The language changed to support the narrative each nation wished to tell about itself. What had been openly described as restoration became construction. What had been acknowledged as inherited became original. The material evidence contradicted the revised narratives. I compiled petrographic analyses from bridge inspections across 5 countries. In every case where underwater foundations had been tested, the stone displayed characteristics inconsistent with documented construction materials. The granite beneath the Charles Bridge did not match Bohemian quarries. The stone beneath Westminster Bridge exceeded the density of documented Dartmoor granite. The material beneath the Anichkov Bridge could not be sourced to any Imperial Russian quarry. Either every credited engineer had access to superior stone sources they never documented, or the stone predated their credited construction. Weathering patterns added another contradiction. Stone beneath water should erode faster than stone above. Moving water, suspended sediment, freeze-thaw cycles, and biological activity all accelerate deterioration. Yet, in every bridge I studied, the underwater stone appeared better preserved than the above-water stonework. The foundations looked newer than the superstructures, despite being older by every other measure. The stone itself was denser, harder, and more resistant to weathering than anything period quarries could have provided. I found a 1967 analysis of Westminster Bridge pier material in the Institution of Civil Engineers archive. The examining geologist noted crystalline structures in the underwater granite that were inconsistent with natural formation. The stone appeared to have been processed using techniques that altered its molecular structure, increasing density and weathering resistance. The report offered no explanation for how 19th century technology could have achieved this processing. The analysis was filed without follow-up. Not similar, identical. The phrase repeated in my notes as I compared findings across sites and centuries. The geometric ratios were identical. The material contradictions were identical. The pattern of discovery, documentation, and erasure was identical. Coincidence could explain 2 sites, perhaps 3. But the pattern extended across every major bridge I examined, spanning constructions attributed to 8 centuries of supposed independent engineering. The repetition was not coincidental, it was systematic. Someone had built a network of bridge foundations across territories that 17th century maps labeled Tartaria. Someone had used materials and techniques that exceeded any documented historical capability. Someone had established geometric standards that every subsequent era unconsciously maintained while claiming credit for original construction. And someone, across multiple countries and centuries, had systematically erased the evidence whenever maintenance work exposed what lay beneath. The absence of attribution troubled me most. Every bridge I investigated credited a specific engineer, architect, or patron. Thomas Page for Westminster Bridge, Peter Parler for Charles Bridge, James Eads for the St. Louis Crossing. These men were celebrated as innovators, their names inscribed on plaques and preserved in engineering histories. Yet their documentation consistently avoided claiming credit for the foundations. Page's published writings described adapting existing pier positions. Parler's diary referenced structures already in place. Eads's logs mentioned encountered masonry without explaining its origin. I searched for any historical figure who claimed to have designed or built the submerged foundations of major bridges. The search yielded nothing. No medieval bishop took credit for pier installation. No Renaissance architect described foundation geometry. No Victorian engineer explained where the underwater stone originated. The most sophisticated elements of these structures, the components that bore the greatest loads and required the most precise engineering, remained anonymous across every archive I examined. Passive voice dominated all documentation regarding foundations. The piers were placed, the stone was positioned, the chambers were sealed. Active construction, the deliberate placement of materials by identified workers following designed plans, appeared only in descriptions of superstructure work. Below the waterline, agency disappeared. The language treated foundations as natural features rather than constructed elements, as if they had simply existed before anyone arrived to build upon them. This pattern extended beyond bridges. I examined construction records for star fortifications across Central and Eastern Europe. The geometric bastions that appeared on 17th and 18th century maps throughout territories labeled Tartaria. The fortifications at Terezin, Przemyśl, and Brest-Litovsk all displayed the same documentary characteristics. Credited architects described modifications and improvements. None claimed to have designed the original geometric layouts. The star patterns, requiring sophisticated mathematical calculation to provide overlapping fields of fire, appeared in records as pre-existing features that military engineers merely adapted. A 1683 survey of the fortifications at Komarno, held in the Vienna War Archive, described the star layout as antiqui dispositionis, of ancient arrangement. The surveyor was documenting a fortress that official history attributed to 16th century Habsburg construction, yet he described its geometric foundation as ancient, using terminology that implied origins beyond documented memory. His survey focused on proposed modifications to the existing structure. He never questioned who had established the original geometry or when. The alignment between bridges and star fortifications was not coincidental. I mapped the positions of both across Central Europe. In multiple cities, bridges connected directly to star fort complexes along precise geometric axes. The Charles Bridge in Prague aligned with the Vyšehrad fortifications. The Chain Bridge in Budapest connected to the Citadella on Gellert Hill along a bearing that matched the fort's primary bastion orientation. These alignments suggested integrated planning, infrastructure designed as components of larger networks rather than isolated crossings. If bridges and star forts were elements of the same system, their shared anonymity made sense. You cannot credit individual engineers with components of a network that predated their documented existence. The absence of attribution was not oversight or modesty, it was necessity. The builders could not be named because acknowledging their existence would require acknowledging that something far older and more extensive had preceded the civilizations that claimed to have built these structures. I returned to the material evidence. The sealed chambers beneath bridge piers displayed consistent characteristics across every site where inspection records survived. They were rectangular, approximately 2 meters by 1.5 meters in standard dimensions. They were stone-lined with the same dense, unweathered material used for the pier foundations themselves. They contained no artifacts, no inscriptions, no obvious purpose. Yet their placement was deliberate, aligned with pier center lines and spaced at regular intervals along bridge lengths. The chambers were not storage spaces or structural voids. Their walls were too precisely finished for mere cavities in construction. A 1924 Deaver inspection of Westminster Bridge described the sealed apertures as having fitted stone surrounds, as if designed for repeated access. The chambers had doors, or had once had doors, before systematic sealing rendered them permanently inaccessible. What required access beneath bridge piers? What function demanded finished chambers at regular intervals along river crossings? Some researchers proposed hydraulic explanations. The chambers might have regulated water pressure, using the river's own force to stabilize the structures above. A 1987 engineering paper theorized that similar chambers in Roman aqueducts had served pressure equalization functions, preventing destructive surges during flood conditions. If the bridge chambers served comparable purposes, they represented hydraulic engineering far more sophisticated than any documented medieval or early modern technology. They represented understanding of fluid dynamics that would not be formally codified in Western engineering until the 20th century. The star forts presented parallel mysteries. Their geometric precision required trigonometric calculations that attributed builders should not have possessed. The angles between bastions, calculated to create overlapping defensive coverage, followed mathematical relationships that European military engineering did not formally develop until the 17th century. Yet forts displaying these relationships appeared on maps dated centuries earlier, described in contemporary documents as already ancient. A 1,594 survey of fortifications along the Ottoman Habsburg frontier noted that the most geometrically precise fortresses were those that local tradition attributed to unknown previous inhabitants. Newer fortifications, those with documented construction histories, displayed cruder geometry and less sophisticated defensive planning. The pattern inverted expected development. Older structures were more advanced than newer ones, as if knowledge had been lost rather than gained across the centuries. The territory marked as Tartaria on 17th century maps encompassed these fortifications, these bridges, these networks of infrastructure that displayed impossible consistency across vast distances. Mainstream historians dismissed Tartaria as cartographic fiction, a label applied to unknown territories by mapmakers who had never visited them. But the infrastructure told a different story. Something had existed across these territories, something that built to common standards, using common materials, following common geometric principles. Something that vanished from documented history while its physical remains continued bearing loads, channeling traffic, defending cities. The absence of names was not accidental. Whoever built these foundations had been systematically erased from historical memory. Their bridges remained. Their fortifications remained. Their precision remained measurable in engineering surveys conducted centuries after their supposed construction dates. But their identity had been overwritten, replaced by the names of those who came later and claimed credit for inheritance rather than creation. I returned to Regensburg on a gray afternoon in November. The stone bridge carried its usual traffic, pedestrians crossing between the Old Town and Stadthof, cyclists navigating the narrow medieval roadway, tourists pausing to photograph the Danube below. Nothing appeared unusual. The bridge functioned exactly as bridges should, bearing loads, connecting shores, channeling movement across water. No one passing above suspected what lay beneath. I stood at the midpoint and looked down at the river. The water was high from autumn rains, brown with sediment carried from upstream. Somewhere beneath that murky surface, the sealed chambers remained. The granite foundations continued holding their alignment, bearing weights they were never officially designed to bear. The geometric precision I had measured persisted, unchanged, since whoever had placed those stones had finished their work and departed without leaving names. The city had celebrated the bridge's supposed 875th anniversary in 2010. Ceremonies honored Bishop Otto I, the credited founder whose construction records did not exist. Speeches praised medieval engineering ingenuity. the vision of 12th century builders who had spanned the Danube with unprecedented skill. No one mentioned the Latin chronicles that described renovation rather than construction. No one referenced the 15th century surveyor who found the foundations older than memory. The celebration honored a narrative rather than a history. I had spent 3 years examining bridges across 4 continents. The evidence was circumstantial but consistent. Geometric ratios that matched across sites separated by thousands of miles. Foundation materials that exceeded documented quarry sources. Construction sequences that showed superstructures built upon pre-existing bases. Documentation that shifted from acknowledgement of inheritance to claims of original construction. Sealed chambers systematically closed without investigation. Names credited for adaptation rather than creation. I could not prove that a civilization called Tartaria had built these foundations. The maps bearing that name showed territories, not construction projects. The label had disappeared from cartography by the 19th century, replaced by the national boundaries that modern history recognized. Whatever Tartaria had meant to 17th century mapmakers, it was not a term that contemporary archaeology accepted or investigated. The hypothesis remained outside mainstream discourse, dismissed as pseudo-history by institutions that had never examined the engineering evidence. What I could prove was simpler and more troubling. The bridges we celebrated as achievements of credited eras rested on foundations those eras did not build. The Victorian engineers, medieval bishops, Renaissance architects, and imperial planners had all adapted something they found rather than creating something new. Their innovations were real. Thomas Page did design Westminster Bridge's arches. Peter Parler did engineer the Charles Bridge's towers. James Eads did pioneer pneumatic caisson construction. But they built upon foundations that predated their involvement, using infrastructure that someone else had placed. The linguistic shift had concealed this inheritance. Restoration became construction. Adaptation became creation. The language we used to describe these structures erased the distinction between what was built and what was found. By the 20th century, the erasure was complete. Every bridge was credited to its documented engineer. The foundations beneath were assumed to be part of that credited construction. No one asked who had built the parts that mattered most. The sealed chambers haunted me. Across every site I had examined, the response to discovered anomalies followed identical patterns. Document briefly. Classify as non-functional. Seal permanently. Move on. Engineers encountered evidence of something they did not understand, something that did not fit the narratives they had been trained to accept, and they closed it away. The chambers were not investigated because investigating them would require questioning assumptions that engineering education did not permit questioning. I thought about the petrographic analyses, the stone that did not match documented quarries, the crystalline structures that suggested processing techniques beyond any documented capability. I thought about the weathering patterns, underwater foundations that appeared newer than the superstructures above them, despite being older by every other measure. I thought about the geometric consistency, identical ratios across bridges attributed to different centuries, different engineers, different civilizations. The evidence pointed toward capabilities that official history did not acknowledge. We had inherited more than we built. That single recognition changed how I understood the cities I moved through, the infrastructure I relied upon, the histories I had been taught. The bridges carrying traffic across European rivers were not monuments to the eras that claimed them. They were remnants of something older, adapted and renamed, and gradually absorbed into narratives that each subsequent civilization found comfortable. The truth lay beneath the waterline, sealed in chambers that no one wanted to open, preserved in documents that no one wanted to read carefully. The Danube continued flowing beneath me, as it had flowed for millennia before any bridge crossed it, as it would continue flowing long after the names of credited builders were forgotten. The stone bridge stood, as it had stood since before reliable records began, bearing loads it was not supposed to be able to bear, displaying precision it was not supposed to possess, keeping secrets that every maintenance project had worked to deepen rather than reveal. I did not know who had built the foundations beneath my feet. I knew only that they had built with materials and techniques that exceeded anything their supposed successors could replicate. I knew that their work had been systematically attributed to others, their existence erased from historical memory, their infrastructure absorbed into narratives that served the needs of later civilizations rather than the truth of what had come before. The bridge remained. The chambers remained sealed. The documents remained in archives, waiting for readers who would notice the discrepancies between official narratives and recorded observations. The photographs from 1861 and 1890 and 1936 remained, showing foundations complete before superstructure work began, showing anomalies that engineers documented and then concealed. A tourist asked me to take her photograph with the old town behind her. I obliged, framing the shot to include the bridge towers and the cathedral beyond. She thanked me and continued across, unaware of what she was walking above, unaware that the medieval stonework beneath her feet was neither medieval nor stone in the way she understood those terms. The rain began as I reached the northern shore. I turned back to look at the crossing one final time. The bridge looked ordinary, ancient in the way tourists expected ancient things to look, solid and weathered and reassuringly historical. It would still look ordinary tomorrow and next year and next century, carrying traffic and photographs and celebrations of anniversaries that honored fictions rather than facts. Somewhere beneath the brown water, the granite foundations held their positions. The sealed chambers kept their silence. The precision that should not have existed continued defying every explanation that did not require acknowledging what the maps had once labeled Tartaria. And we continued crossing, confident that we knew who had built the bridges beneath our feet, certain of histories that the stones themselves contradicted with every load they bore. The bridge stood. It always had. We had simply forgotten to ask who built the part that mattered most.